Right now, though, let's talk about two of the big issues. First, Rowdy Tenants, but also the migrant bill, the illegal migration bill, where government has diffused a rebellion from backbenchers. Let's talk to Conservative MP Jonathan Gullis. Good morning to you.
Hey, I'm Julie. How are you doing?
Very well indeed. Lovely to have you on the show. I do want to ask you, first of all, before we get on to the migrant illegal migration bill, about this plan to evict rowdy tenants in just 2 weeks. It's a crackdown, strengthen landlords' powers. It's not just council tenants, it's also for private tenants as well. Basically, if they're disruptive to neighbours, three strikes, you are out. If you cause damage, fall behind on their rent, they're out within 2 weeks. Homeowners who rent out their properties on Airbnb as party houses, they're going to be facing problems as well, having to go on a new database. And this is about an action plan, the Prime Minister says, to increase, to tackle issues of antisocial behaviour. I know a lot of people who are landlords say this is a massive issue, getting rid of tenants who either don't pay their bills or a nuisance. It takes months and months and months to get rid of them once you've even got to court. This is a measure that many will welcome. Do you welcome it?
I absolutely welcome it. I've dealt with a number of constituents from across Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork who have raised concerns about certain neighbours where it's very clear that drug dealing or drug abuse is taking place, late night drinking, people exposing themselves in the middle of the street at all hours of the night.
I mean, it is Stoke-on-Trent, you know.
No, Julia, come on, you know Stoke-on-Trent well. That is not
I got the Stoke mentioned in before you did.
I can't believe it. Your husband's very sound and you know that he wouldn't allow that to happen. So let's be careful with that one, Julia. But all I can say is that, you know, this is a very welcome situation because, of course, I do understand why some landlords would be nervous about the banning of Section 21 orders. But actually what the Prime Minister has done is getting that balance right between landlords not being able to randomly just kick people out without fair notice versus those landlords who obviously want to make sure they actually have their properties looked after. And when you've got a couple of Scrotes who need kicking out, then obviously we'll be able to do that much quicker, and that will make a big difference to local communities, because it's not right that if you're living in a rented property or in a council property, which obviously is being partially funded by us, the taxpayer, that you have some sort of God-given right to do what you want. It's unfair on neighbours who've got young families in many cases.
Yeah, and people have to go out to work. I mean, and that is the thing, isn't it? Is that one family, one tenant, they can make life hell for, you know, dozens of other families. And again, I was saying I could fill the whole show with stories about, you know, bad neighbours. And I've been renting, and we had some living. I mean, genuinely, we were going to move out. We love our home. We were going to move out because the owners above were so awful and horrible. Hello, if you're watching, you know who you are. I mean, genuinely, I opened a bottle of champagne. I'm literally stood there in the hallway as they moved out going, bye, bye. I mean, and our home has been wonderful ever since. And it really, it can drive people. I mean, I think it can make people physically and mentally ill to be disturbed by not just the lack of sleep, but the stress levels that people have if you've got really bad neighbours. But again, you know, if you've got really good neighbours, how wonderful that is for a community.
Well, also, Julia, it's sadly in many cases where you've got particularly these late night parties, which are normally drug and alcohol fueled. Yeah. You've got criminality coming into your streets, and it does just take literally one's house on that street to ruin the entire street for the neighbourhood. Yeah. And you know, I love walking up and down those communities where I'll get every person knocking, asking me to come to their door and give me the whisper about number X down there. A bloody so-and-so needs a good kick up the backside, go and get a job, needs to be kicked out of their house. And I couldn't agree with them more. And finally, I'm going to be able to work with them to deliver that result much quicker.
I tell you what, that is one of the key things, though. We've got an awful lot of people. We've got this, these people who aren't in the workforce, something that actually the Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, is mentioning, people retiring early, but it's not often people retiring early. There's loads of able-bodied people who aren't working. When those people have got to get up in the morning, you'll find they won't be quite so many rowdy parties because they've got to actually get a decent night's sleep. So I'm a big fan getting everyone to work, because then they become much better neighbours. Let's also talk about the migration issue, because actually one of these reasons why the illegal migration bill is a very popular bill. I mean, a lot of the papers don't like it, human rights lawyers don't like it, but an awful lot of not just Tory MPs and Tory voters, but an awful lot of Labour voters as well are very big fans of this, is because they actually don't want a bunch of people who've arrived on a dinghy across the channel, having paid people traffickers, and ending up in a hotel or a house at the end of their street. That's the reality. I wouldn't, you wouldn't, no one else would. But the UK government, we're told, has diffused a rebellion from backbenchers wanting to toughen up new rules for removing migrants. You were the vanguard of this. What did you want to do, and why have you backed down?
So, first of all, what we want to do is make sure the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary can deliver on that pledge to stop the boats, because ultimately the Conservative Party will win or lose the next election, in my opinion, especially across the Red Wall, on this particular issue, because this is had cut through across the country. Because as you say, Julia, people are absolutely livid to see millions of pounds a day of taxpayers' money being used for hotels, seeing people illegally enter the system, enter our country, gaming the system, coming from safe mainland France, but claiming somehow fleeing persecution is simply not right, especially when this country has, as we've already heard since 2015, had 500,000 people come here through safe and legal routes via from Ukraine, Hong Kong, Syria and Afghanistan. What we wanted to do was to toughen the bill up in order to make sure we close every legal loophole. So that makes it clear that these Rule 39 orders, that, by the way, have no basis in law, were not part of the Convention on Human Rights when it was signed back in the 1950s, something that came in 2005. We want to make it clear that UK judges are simply to ignore those rulings. Others are to disapply further sections of the Human Rights Act, which we think could be used in litigation to frustrate us removing people. I've got two amendments up today. One is actually banning the use of hotels. Another one is preventing people being allowed to return if they somehow lodge a successful human rights claim in the upper tribunal with the Home Office. And then Bill Cash was doing one as well on injunctions, making sure that injunctions can't be put on at the last minute to prevent us from removing people. If we do this, we believe this will legally close off loopholes. It means that we'll still go through the legal challenges in the courts, but it ultimately should mean that we can get this policy off the ground quite literally and getting people off to Rwanda as soon as possible.
But this is the thing, isn't it? The courts are supposed to enforce the law as opposed to make the law. We've got into this strange situation where the interpretation of human rights legislation and even asylum legislation has basically meant that no one ever gets deported from this country, really. And that is not what the British people want. And it's also what is not a requirement under our international commitments. We spoke to George Brandis. He's a former High Commissioner to the UK from Australia, but he had an instrumental role in the Australian government when they dealt with their boat migrant problem, which was genuinely people were dying on huge numbers and the seas north of Australia. And he pointed out, you have a duty of care to these people, but the duty of care doesn't mean they have to live in your country. You just have to find them somewhere safe to live, and that is the crucial issue here.
Well, as you say, Julia, it's the humane thing to do to want to stop people needlessly risking their lives to cross the English Channel when they don't need to, because they're already in safe mainland France, having travelled through other safe mainland European countries which are perfectly acceptable and safe to claim asylum in. And when you've got Albanians who are, members of NATO wanting to join the EU, coming here and claiming all sorts of spurious human rights claims in order to try and remain here, it's simply not acceptable. When, as you and I both know, why would you spend $4,500 to come illegally when you can get a flight for 30 quid? Yeah. It simply is because you don't want our border force to know who you are, and you want to obviously get involved in criminality. And sadly, we know there's a lot of Albanian drug smuggling gangs sadly going across the UK right now. But to answer your question earlier, Julius, about why we've not pushed to a vote, we did have good conversations with the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister. We've been promised that meaningful engagement over the next 2 weeks. We'll enter those talks in good faith. But let me be very clear, if those talks are not upheld in good faith, if we do not see compromise being made from the Prime Minister's side, as well as obviously ours, or if we do not see at least movement towards what we're trying to achieve here, then at report stage, we may well call a vote. We don't want to have to do this, but ultimately, if that does happen, it will be the opposition that wins the government the day, and I don't think that's a good look for the Conservative Party. OK, and just finally, I want to ask you about the election of Humza Yousaf, the continuity Sturgeon candidate, as was described. He won the SNP leadership contest by the golden ratio, 52-48, against Kate Forbes. He's vowed to push ahead with Scottish independence for a second referendum, but also with those very controversial independence trans self-ID laws as well. What do you make of his election? Do you welcome it? Well, I think it's a great win for the Scottish Conservatives, who I know, I think fairly, would have worried about Kate Forbes coming in, clearly on a pro-conservative social platform on social policies as well as the economy. Humza has an appalling track record, not pointed out by anyone else but his own SNP colleagues in his leadership contest. And I think the nickname Humza Useless is around for a reason. And I suspect that Keir Starmer will also be rubbing his hands to the Labour Party, seeing an opportunity for Labour to come back. So I think that the SNP have done themselves no favours. But I think for the Union, for our United Kingdom, for the benefit of getting out of the never-ending discussion on whether or not Scotland should remain part of the UK. And now we can finally start talking about the SNP's failure in education, failure in healthcare, because ultimately those are things that the people of Scotland care about, as well as the people of the United Kingdom.
OK, Jonathan Gullis, Conservative MP, Stoke-on-Trent North, thank you very much indeed for joining us.